Hi Reza, it's Harlan Ferguson from your Tuesday 11 a.m. lab, and this is my video submission for the final assignment. Unfortunately, I already recorded this and then realized that my mic was muted, but now I am sure that it is not muted, so let's run through it all again. So, we start off by reading the two CSV files that you provided, the training data and the testing data. And then we're tasked to print out 8 samples from there. So that's just shown right here and right here. Then we're asked to concatenate those two data frames into a singular one. So following the naming convention of all the other assignments, I assigned it to my DF. And then we're going to go check for missing data. So that's this line here. And we see, since there are so many columns in this data set, it only shows you kind of like the head and the tail of the columns. So we can see the first 5 here has all the data, whereas the last 5 is missing quite a bit of the data, which is not great. Then we want to look at the shape of the concatenated data frame. So you can see from this output here, we've got a shape of 2301 and 131. Meaning we currently have 131 columns with 2,301 rows. Then we're looking at the different data types of the columns. From this output again, it's just a head and tail, so it looks like we're primarily dealing with float 64. We make the assumption that that's kind of across the board throughout, but we would have to kind of just individually check because this output doesn't give enough information for that. And then I go in and I've made a histogram of the average ages. So these are patients affected with ALS. You can see the bulk majority on the top end of this bell chart here. They started around 50 years old, end at around, I'd say 62. Yeah, 62. So that's where majority, the average ages for these ALS patients. And then following the graph, it's a lot less likely for someone to be in their 20s, 30s, and it starts ramping up when you start hitting about your 40s, and vice versa. It starts ramping down again there. So when we're done with that histogram, I've also generated a box plot. And so looking through the different columns, I decided on the ALS FRS, which is their functional rating scale for the disease. And so patients are asked a series of questions and rated on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being fully disabled and 4 having normal function. So just like basic human functions like walking, talking, breathing, all of that gets on all that is marked down and then totaled for a max total of 40. And then obviously a minimum of 0. So with this box plot, we can see majority of our data falls between the 30 to 36 range in that score, with our median being this green line here, and the median is about a 33. So on average, the patients are scoring a 33 on the test. And then we've got a short whisker here, which just indicates that there's less likelihood of getting a higher score or a perfect score around 40. And then a long whisker following this box, indicating that there's still a good amount of people who are getting scores in the range of 20 to 30. And then these dots on this point here are just outliers in the data. So you do have some people who are scoring really, really low on the test, so they have very low functioning. But yeah, so I'm just going to run the rest of that. Another pop-up is going to come up any moment. But let me just try, I'm going to minimize that and just try and find where we are next. So next we have centroids. Perfect, okay. So following that graph and knowing that we do have some not numbers, we want to either drop those or replace them. I decided to replace them using an imputer. So we're looking at the missing values, and natively Python doesn't support not a number. They just have like none type. But NumPy does support not a number, and it's backed by the IEEE. And the NumPy is not a number is compatible with the not a number in the pandas data frame. So the two of those will work together fine. So I import NumPy at the top, and then we're just calling it np.nan, which then gives you that not a number value. And then when we find that not a number, we're looking for a median strategy. So we're going to try and put an average of that column in its place. We're also dropping some features that don't provide any value to the data set. So in this case, we're going to be dropping ID and subject ID because that's not actually going to tell the clustering anything in terms of like accurately sorting it. So we're just going to drop those. And then we're just going to fit transform that imputer into this variable x. So now we have our full data set and all the values are filled in. So now the assignment asks to run KMeans on this data before applying the PCA. So I specify 2 clusters because further down I found that 2 is the best, and we'll go over that later on the assignment. I had to initialize this or else you get a bunch of warnings because they're depreciating this, and so I just added that. And then again, setting a random state so I can just regenerate the same model output every time. And then for the centroid shape, we're getting 2 main groups, and we're using 129 columns there. And then the cluster, so the cluster number 1 contains 1,711 samples. So the first cluster takes nearly 3/4 of the data, and the second cluster takes the last quarter. And then our raw silhouette score comes out to 54%. And then I run it again, but this time, so this time I'm applying K-means with different clusters and then seeing what output gives us the best. So the silhouette score for 2 clusters, we get the 54. For 7 clusters, we get 31, and for 10, we get 24. So already we kind of know that there's going to be quite a drop off the more clusters you add. So we're pretty much just going to stick with 2 clusters for this data set. And 54 isn't great, but it's better than 31. So we'll keep on keeping on with that. So now I'm applying the PCA. And so the math was a little tricky for me to fully understand. But my general takeaway was that it makes the data more manageable for training. So if you have large variances, it kind of brings them all together. So then we've got this principal components variable that I then fit transform our data frame onto, or our features onto. Then we get a ratio here. So our ratio just has an array of every column and its score. So we can see like the first column has a really big impact with an 8.3, but as we go through, it kind of drops off in some areas. And then we're getting so all the variances where there's over 95%. There's only 3 where we run into that have over 95%. So those are kind of the three that we want to be looking at. And then, so we're doing K-means again, but we wanted to look at it in a different or a larger range. Or sorry, we're looking at plotting the K-means to see at what point we decide when we want clusters. So this is kind of the graph that was in the assignment documentation. But when you only have 2 clusters, that's the highest point, and it only trails down from there. And for something like this clustering, you want it on the higher end, but you can see it drops dramatically if you just add one extra cluster, drops even more dramatically when you add another, gets a little bit better, but then keeps dropping and dropping and dropping. So obviously if there was a point where this graph shot up, then we would know that that cluster would be the best, but it really just trails down, and it's going to keep on trailing down until we hit near 0. So 2 clusters in this scenario is the best for us there. And then finally, I just do K-means again, but with 2 clusters, and then use a scatter plot here. And then we've got the 2 clusters. We have a purple for the one principal component and yellow for the other. And we can see, as we already know, 75% of the data is in this first sector, and the other 25 is in this one. So that's what we're looking at. Thank you for your time, and take care.